so much for coming back after lunch. The Avon Hills Initiative, who along with St. John's Outdoor University, worked hard to bring you this conference. They welcome your thoughts, concerns, questions, and ideas for future programs and work. Also, please note the conference evaluation on the white paper in your folder. Please fill it out throughout the day and return it to the registration table. There will be a short break with refreshments in the exhibit hall after the session. Now I'd like to introduce you to Ron Bowen.
Thank you, Carol. Hi, everybody. It's great to, I didn't know about your program here, and Colleen tells me it's every other year. It's great that there's so much interest. I think it's fabulous. And I'm happy to be up here to talk with you guys. I have a company called Prairie Restorations, based in Princeton, but we now have 7 sites, 7 locations around Minnesota. And we have been restoring plant communities now for over 40 years. So I've got at least some experience with this. And along the way, finished University of Minnesota training a long time ago as a forester, and then had a fellowship to go back to school in landscape architecture, which essentially was kind of a venture in philosophy as much as anything. And it was very worthwhile. I had a Bush Fellowship and had a great opportunity in the mid-'80s to just kind of consider what's happening with landscapes, the way we kind of treat native plant communities, what we as a society can do to work towards restoration. And so I assume that's why you're here. Many of you probably own property, and maybe you're dabbling in this, which is really a lifelong experience. It's very gratifying, can be very gratifying, and somewhat challenging, but really fun, and lots of steps along the way. Everyone is valuable. They're all helpful. So the topic that I'm trying to address today really is one of the landscape, in a way, pre-settlement. And what was that, and how important is that really? 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when we started Prairie Resto, the goal was to try and recreate landscapes as they were roughly at 1850. But as the years go by, you realize that it's always been and always will be a moving target. That landscapes and plant communities constantly change. They always have, and they always will. Now, in the last 200 years here in the Midwest, they've changed very dramatically because we've taken away almost all the prairie. We now have this giant plant community called agricultural crop fields. And of course, 200 years ago, that wasn't present in the Midwest. And now it's by far the dominant landscape. So in some ways it makes the remnants more valuable, more important, and more critical, and it's made our work, I think, more sustainable in the context of how do you pay the bills. So again, we have worked with prairies and wetlands, savannas, woodlands in Minnesota, and I'll show you a picture here in a minute of a 3-volume set of books that was done by the DNR. They classify plant communities, and there are over 300 sort of defined plant communities just in Minnesota. So in reality, in the game of restoration, you could be trying for any one of those or a combination of those, and understanding those plant communities is really critical. That's more important actually than knowing the individual plant species within the community. Again, that's something that we've learned over time, that it's great to know prairie phlox and passiflower and but you have to know the context of those plants, how they fit into a savanna or a prairie or a wetland. And then you can start to utilize practices, management and so on like this to maintain those plant communities. So the Marshner map, and that's, I have a, they don't print these anymore, so this one is a paper copy. The original ones, of which I have a few, are actually printed on like dollar bill paper, cloth paper. And I used to give these out to schools, and when I would go and talk, I would get tubes of 25 free from the Forest Service. Yeah. And I went back one time, and I think it was probably in the 70s, to get some more, and they said, oh, they've quit printing them and you can't get them anymore. So, but the last ones I have been very, very expensive. They're collectible in my view. But the Marshner map, and if anybody wants to look closer afterwards, I'll have this here. Is really a wonderful thing, and I'll give you the short story on this. In 1930, there was a guy named Francis Marshner who was commissioned to put the original vegetation map of Minnesota together. Now, believe it or not, Marshner never set foot in Minnesota. He was based in Washington, D.C., and his whole lifetime, he never even came here. But he deciphered the original land survey notes. And if you know the land survey process, essentially establishing the grid system sections, and so the surveyors were commissioned to go north or south to north on every section line and record corner posts and set the corner posts. Usually that would mean finding bearing trees. And if you go back into their records, and here's the St. Cloud area. This is the metro right here. This is the curve of the Minnesota-Mississippi River comes together right there. And so you can see here's the Mississippi River Valley. These yellow prairies, the yellow on this is real prairie. The darker yellow is wet prairie. But these I would call terrace prairies. These are sandy areas along the Mississippi River that sustain prairie. This is the one right there where we are today. And so we were on the very edge. We're right about there. We're on the edge of this maple basswood forest, but just a little bit to the south and east was a pretty big open prairie in 1850. So again, we used to target 1850. I don't do that so much anymore. Things change. In 1500, this was almost all prairie. If you went back to 1000 AD, the prairie would have been maybe even further to the east. So just as an example, if you look at the bigger time scale, things change, and this isn't focused, but so I'll go by it. But this again is the Minnesota or Mississippi River Valley, and this is the St. John's area. If you go, some of you, I bet have seen this. If you go on the trail south of the St. Paul or the St. Cloud campus, and you go down the trail, there's a large bronze interpretive plaque that talks about the first settlers here. Are you familiar with this, some of you? It says that was the original establishment of the St. John's Monastery. And that it talks a little bit, very interestingly, about the vegetation. That they took water directly from the river, that's what they drank. And this was on the shores of the Mississippi. The bank and immediate area around it was covered with plum and juneberry. They ate a lot of these foods, but when you got up over the bank to the west, it was wide open prairie. And now, of course, today we go there and we look over and we see the city, and the city has essentially been forested with, elm trees and hackberry and whatever else, probably from Bailey Nursery. Yeah. So, and that's all good, but it's harder for us generally to visualize what was there. Now, I live just across the river from that plaque on the Sherburne County side. My home is there, and it's an overgrown oak savanna. It's still got 250-year-old bur oaks. It's got a lot of buckthorn and other things that I'm clearing out, but it gets a little easier to visualize what that landscape was pre-settlement when you start to cut away some of the younger species, green ash and buckthorn, of course, and so on. This is a sample of the original survey notes. Now, the original surveyors, some of them were really meticulous and wrote great notes and made sketches. But a lot of times you have to work at this. You won't have time right here, but they spoke a slightly different language. They called pin oak. Typically, they called it jack oak or black oak, and not northern pin oak. They called bur oak oftentimes scrub oak. So again, once you learn their language, you can read through this, and you can visualize that every mile is a section corner, and they would find a bearing tree, and they might say, 30 degrees east of north, there was a 24-inch bur oak tree. Well, if you're an ecologist, that says this was a savanna. You find big bur oak trees in the savanna. Or if it was a sugar maple, you would go, oh, well, that was a maple basswood forest, or a basswood perhaps, or whatever. And oftentimes they would say, like, even things like this, mouth of stream. Is that what it says, or what does it say? Mouth of stream.
Yep.
Not fueling any, I'm not quite sure. There's lots of bits of information in these. If you look up on the top one, to a point on the river said by old voyagers, and so on and so on. Marshner took all this information for the whole state of Minnesota and reconfigured the map. He made this map by looking at what are the bearing trees, what species, how big were they, and to my experience in 50 years now, it was dead accurate. You can go today and you can find where the edge of a savanna was on this map, and you can still find evidence that that is exactly where it was. So I've never found this map to be off. Usually it's accurate within a quarter mile. So it's really a helpful tool in the restoration process. You can find some things out at these sites if you want to have a little fun on your own. You can find these surveys. If you know a section line or a section number, township, you can look it up, and you can follow the path the surveyors took, and you can interpret. You can see what were they doing. They might say, at a certain number of links and chains, they came into a wetland, and they will be very specific about that. From the past section corner, they might say, we went 116 chains and entered a wetland. We went another 30 chains and left the wetland. It's a very fun process if you own property to look at that. Now, these are the books I mentioned. These were done in the last 20 years by the DNR, and they're fairly complex, but this is really the best source of plant community information. So if you wanted to find out, about the characteristics of a prairie, or what kinds of prairie there are, wet prairie, dry prairie, there are many others, you could look in this volume and you could find out all kinds of plant information, associations between plants. And so again, these books are very helpful. We sell them at our bookstores. You can get them elsewhere. Okay, really, what is the prairie itself and the savanna? And how did that interface go on? Again, the St. John's campus is right on the edge of a number of things. Big woods, a lot of wetlands, of course. One of the handouts, the photograph one, shows an air photo of the campus from 1938. compared to today. And that's just a little tidbit I threw together for you. It's interesting because some of the wetlands today were not here in 1938. And I suspect that's because they did some, they built some dikes or dams, they impounded some water. Or it could also be that in 1938, those fields, if you were, had been drained, tiled, and ditched, and that when people came along with more of an ecological interest at the campus here, they plugged those ditches and broke those tile lines, and the water filled back up. So that's kind of an interesting aspect. This is a dry prairie from out in South Dakota, so some of these species are not here. This long-headed yellow coneflower is a western plant that comes into western Minnesota, but it doesn't come as far east as Stearns County. You know, in our restoration work, we can recreate, on a real serious effort, maybe 100 species. When you look at a real prairie like this, you generally would find 250 species on an acre. So on a football field size, 200 to 300 species would be fairly common. In a restoration football size, if we can hit 75, we're very successful. And typically, for money reasons and other reasons, you end up with maybe 40 or 50 species. And that's a pretty good effort. So again, you know, really what is the savanna and what is the prairie? How do we define the difference? I usually say that if an area has more than 25% canopy cover, it becomes a savanna, and less than 50% canopy cover, that's kind of the savanna niche. If it's more open, it's a prairie. If it's more forested, it's a woods. And there are lots of different kinds of woods. This is a very typical savanna. Very, very good balance. This is a remnant on a sandy ridge up in northwest Minnesota. And it's pretty indicative of the balance. Now, how did that balance stay that way? Why didn't, you know, trees fill in? Why did the prairie grasses maintain? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly because the prairie grasses are very competitive underground. And so they occupy a lot of the soil, the moisture, and nutrients. Makes it a little bit more challenging, a lot more challenging for trees. The other reason, though, one of the big reasons, well, precip, soil type, and then fire. And so if you look at one of the handouts, it mentions that of 247 documented fires, only one, and this will come as a surprise to most of you, only one of those was caused by lightning. The other 246 were caused by Native Americans. So really, I think that savannas are savannas a lot because of human interplay, a lot because of fires that were started to bring in game by the Native Americans. They would burn these areas because then they would get green and it'd be good hunting. So we used to say that most of this was caused by fires caused by lightning. I don't think that's really true. I think in the edge, these edge areas where the battle is going on between forest and grassland, that interface, which again goes right through St. Cloud, goes right through the metro, goes through Rochester, goes all the way down St. Louis, all the way down to Austin, Texas, and all the way up through Winnipeg and beyond. That tension zone was a big factor in that was human management with fire. And so, but there was some lightning as well. But, you know, an area like this would go to trees without fire. It would probably go to trees within 25 or 30 years. It would not take very long. So And then wetlands, of course, this is a restored wetland. That's reed canary grass in the background, but the foreground was restored with a nice mix of forbs. And of course, really what you want in most wetlands is sedges. You know, they're really good at fighting invaders. So you can find sedge areas. This is mostly lake sedge, Carex lacustrus. This is a little bit of blue joint grass, which was another dominant grass. And of course, flowers like Canada anemone are very good colonizers, very strong, and good at keeping out exotic plants. And Joe Pieweed, you know, good, really nice wetland plant, swamp milkweed. Most people don't realize swamp milkweed is actually a better monarch plant than common milkweed. This is a very, very good caterpillar plant for monarchs. And so if you have a wetland and you can establish a population of this, it's a very healthy thing for the butterflies. And then we produce seed, of course. So these are seed production plots. Now, when I started, and some of you are undoubtedly here because you have projects, it was really hard to find seed anywhere in the country, really. You could get varietal seed. So in the 30s, in the Great Drought of the 30s, the rangelands of the middle part of North America really dried up, and a lot of grazing forage was lost. And so when the drought started to end in the middle and later 30s, the U.S. government, through the Department of Ag, started looking for selections of strong forage production specimens of the main native grasses, switchgrass, big blue Indian, little blue stem, and so on. And they propagated those via seed and ultimately released them as named varietals. Those were available, my first prairie was 1970, and I could get those, but I didn't want those. I wanted the true representation, the true gene pool, unaltered, unselected, other than by origin. And so in order to find that seed to do restoration work, we had to start to grow our own. Now today you're in a little different world. You can buy that seed. You can buy it from us, but you can also buy it from some competitors. That's great. I think that's a big improvement. It's taken, you know, several decades to really get there, but that needs to be done for other parts of North America, whether it's for prairie plants, wetland plants, or even woodland plants. That whole process needs to be repeated so that you can find the materials, the building blocks that you need to build your restoration. So again, when we first started prairies, local origin seed had to be collected. So we would go to remnants and try and collect it. When we started to grow plants, we always worked with local origin collections. Now, of course, growing plants is a lot easier in some ways. This was a big remnant prairie. We're out with the combine. This was one way we got seed originally. When you couldn't buy local origin, occasionally we could go collect it with a combine and get it in some volume. And so you end up with piles of stems, basically, which then have to be processed with cleaning machinery, and ultimately you can actually get to the point where you have some decent piles of seed and a warehouse full of it. So that's where we are today. We grow plants, and again, going back on that, plants are easier in some ways because with a coffee cup of seed, you can grow 10,000 plants. With a coffee cup of seed, you can go out and seed 10 square feet. So You know, the combination of seed and plants on a good restoration is needed. That's how you do it. There are plants, many species that are not available as seed yet in any volume. And so your project, if you're trying to buy seed of many species, you won't be able to get it. You can get the main species and then supplement it with greenhouse produced seedlings of species that are, in my mind, very worth that investment. And the diversity is critically important. So again, we grow lots of plants. Now, you can see, this is prairie smoke, and some of you, I'm sure, know plants. Some of these plants have come into the trade. Bailey Nursery sells prairie smoke. And things like prairie drop seed and little blue stem. And I don't know when you would have started that, Gordy, but it's probably been 20 years.
Yeah, about that.
But 40 years ago, that wasn't in the trade. So again, that we grow these plants to supplement seeding and or in some cases to do small gardens. So at a small scale, the size of this room or even the size of this podium, plants is pretty much what you use. You don't really get very much into seed. But on a bigger scale like this, you know, we do, oh, this was Colleen's little joke. You know, we do use Roundup to prepare a lot of our sites. It's a step that nobody likes. We don't like it either. But you kind of have to get the site clean, and then you can work it with equipment and get a seed bed and get the seed in the ground. This, by the way, is an old Nesbitt seed drill. The Nesbitt drill was a rangeland drill in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Has anybody ever heard of the Nesbitt seed drill? Yeah? Jim Truax, the Truax seed drill, which, I don't know where that is. Do we have that, Colleen? Okay. The Truax seed drill is made by a guy named Jim Truax, who is, I'm going to say, 78 years old now. And he's a good friend of mine in Minneapolis, graduated from Robbinsdale High School, and bought the patent when the Nesbitt company was going out of business. I think in about the late 60s. So Jim bought that and then started to improvise it and built his Truax seed drill, which is now they're used around the world in mineland reclamation, prairie restoration, and so on. But they all started with this old Nesbitt drill. And these drills are made to handle light, chaffy seed. So unlike a bag of lawn seed that you would buy, you know, at the hardware store, this seed, oftentimes, a lot of it, it bridges in a container like this. If you load that with seed, if it didn't have an agitator in the bottom that really kept it, it would actually, even bouncing along, it would bridge and it wouldn't be coming out. And so these drills are made with what's called a picker wheel, and they actually grab the seed out of the seed box and force it down into the assembly down below. So that's kind of the heart and soul of Jim's machinery. Jim is just one hell of a mechanic. He is. I've never seen anybody as good with metal as this guy is. So anyway, he was a natural to take on that role. I don't know what's going to happen when Jim passes, which might not be too long from now. And I don't know what will happen to the Truax Seed Company, our drill company. It's a very valuable part of our industry, so I hope somebody picks it up and keeps it going. So again, you can throw seed on a small site by hand, and again, plants like pasque-flower, the state flower of South Dakota, have to be added, basically have to be added as a plug, a live plant. When I first started in 1970, I bought 1 ounce. I didn't know a lot about local origin and so on back in those days. And I bought 1 ounce of passiflower seed from a place in Europe for $1,000. 1 ounce. It was Bruce Dayton's money. And Bruce, of course, the father of our governor, and was a wonderful mentor and friend of mine. He passed a few years ago. But I think if he were here, he would say that might be the best $1,000 he's ever spent. Prairie smoke again, we saw earlier. This is a dry plant. Was very common in the St. Cloud area, by the way. Is still quite common along the Highway 10 railroad tracks. So especially if you get up by Wadena, you can find large patches of it. This is Pucoon, and this is a wonderful plant. There are 3 species. This is really one of the, probably the showiest, Carolina Pucoon. One of those plants that's really essential to a lot of prairies, but that nobody has mastered. It really a tough one. This would be a good one to figure out, Gordy. It produces very little viable seed. The seed that it does produce is extremely hard to collect. And so probably the reproduction of this plant would have to be done asexually with cuttings or something.
Tissue culture, maybe.
Yeah, and the reproducing this plant from seed is really challenging. In a good prairie, however, there are 2 main cocoons. This one and a little shorter, earlier golden one, which is called hoary pucoon. This is hairy pucoon. The other one is hoary pucoon. Hoary pucoon in a good remnant prairie is throughout. Very common. My property on the other side of the river, lo and behold, has a remnant population of hoary pucoon. And even though the property was grazed for 50 years and pretty much beat up on, it lived through. And I've got several hundred plants of hoary pucoon. So it's very tolerant, but to get it to reproduce is very challenging. It would be wonderful to have it in a restoration, and I have it here to talk about for these reasons. There are certain species that you probably will really struggle with to get into a restoration. This is a good example. You know, where do you get the plant? Where do you find the seed? The answer is, to both of those questions, is pretty much nowhere. So if there was a rescue kind of an operation, a road going in or a new airport or something, and there was some plant, this has roots that go down about 18 feet. So transplanting is a bit of a challenge, but it is doable. You don't have to go down. You only have to, if you can get 18 inches of the root, you'll probably have live plant. So, you know, how do you get these plants into your restoration? At the current time, the answer is kind of good luck. And you know, and it is. And unless you're lucky, like at my place, somehow or other, by some miracle, there was a remnant population. Prairie rose will behave this way. Prairie rose can be in the middle of a crop field for 100 years. It'll get plowed or tilled every year, and it'll keep coming up because the roots are so deep. And it will last a long, long time. So when the field gets converted back, if it does, to a prairie, lo and behold, it's got prairie rose ready to go. But there are only a few species that will do that, not very many. Most of them, like prairie phlox, will disappear almost immediately. One turnover of the prairie and this plant will be gone. So to get it back, and this one, by the way, there was a guy here in this area who used to grow a little bit of seed of this. It's a tough one to get seed of. It's a beautiful seed when you get it. But we paid $2,000 for 1 pound, not 1 ounce, but 1 pound of flaxseed. And so it can be very expensive, very scarce. On the project that we put it on, it worked. We did get flax plants. I would say we got 100 flax plants. So that's $20 a piece. Well, you can buy them at the nursery for $1 a piece. So in a case like this, you'd be better off to just buy plugs and put them on your project than to try and chase around and find seed. Number one, you probably won't find it. The guy who used to produce some of it doesn't do it anymore. But it's a wonderful plant, and it should be on most Minnesota Prairie and Savannah restorations. This was a very widespread, adaptable plant, and oftentimes a good remnant prairie has a large population. Very beautiful in my subjective view. On my property, 1 remnant plant. 1 remnant plant. It's been there since I bought the property 10 years ago, and it's still doing just fine. It's very healthy. I'm now reintroducing more flax plants to that site. I've now got a couple hundred. So hopefully that's critical mass, and they will start to find their way. This is another one that should be on virtually every project in Minnesota. This is blue-eyed grass. Cicerentium campestri is the Latin name. There's another Cicerentium montanum. This is the one that should be here in central Minnesota most often. On good remnant prairies, it grows just about like grass. I mean, it's just throughout. It's not available in the trade to speak of. It's a tough one to germinate. Seed collecting is also tedious at best. I don't know of anybody that has any volume of seed, but again, as a discussion point, this should be in the seed form. This should be on every restoration, in my view. You should be able to buy this like you buy black-eyed Susan. You should be able to go out and buy a pound of this, and maybe, on the high side, maybe $300 for a pound. A pound is probably 1 million seeds. So you could take that pound and put it on, let's say, a 10-acre site, and you could very possibly get 5,000 seedlings. Not a bad investment. Pretty good. Today, to do it, we have to grow them as plants, and you have to put them in one at a time. And hope that if you match the site properly, and this one should be an easy match, that with time they'll find their own critical mass and expand and be happy as can be. This is another one, northern bedstraw. Now, this is not a slideshow about plants, but I threw a few of them in here. Bedstraw is another plant that should be almost everywhere. There's dot maps for the state of Minnesota that show where official collections have been made of all the species that have ever been found. Woody plants, herbaceous plants. In Minnesota, there's roughly 2,020 or so species. And all of those plants have a dot map. You can go online and you can see where they've been collected. Some species, 1 dot. One rare collection. Somebody found some Arctic plant that drifted down to the North Shore, and one specimen was found in 1930 maybe. Others, like this, show up statewide, from the Arrowhead to Worthington, Duluth to Moorhead, everywhere. Grows in a variety of habitats, some very shady, some wide open prairie, some sites. So again, it should really be on every job. Today, the only way to put this there is as a plug. And so we're growing seed of this, but it's still in the early stages, but we will have seed. I think within 5 years, this would be available. This is the wild rose I mentioned, Rosa arkansana. this is available in plant form. Lead plant is available as seed, pretty readily available. Another very, very common and good prairie plant. And then the goldenrods, and there's a whole bunch of goldenrods. This is flat top goldenrod, which again is available as seed. We put it on most of our projects because it grew statewide. This is one of our beautiful asters called azuraster. Another very common plant here in the central part of the detention zone. You wouldn't find this in the arrowhead, but you would find it most commonly in the detention zone. Really nice plant. Hard to produce seed of, challenging. So managing sites, obviously invasive plants are your number one target. So buckthorn, reed canary grass, smooth brome. This is actually this young woman is working in some willows that are native, but they're invasive, and so she's taking those down. Here we're probably spot treating, maybe Canada thistle, could be any number of things, but those two strategies are typically used in the management, at the management level. So a little bit of chemical, if it's done properly, is a very valuable tool. And then mechanically weed whipping or cutting or hand pulling in a garden, that's what you do. And, selectively taking out the bad guys and favoring the good guys. I was at a conference just this last Wednesday, the National Canadian Prairie Conference up in Saskatoon. And there was a woman there who presented on the impact of basically plants on the soil and how they change the soil, more or less setting the stage for sort of successional change. Annuals working into kind of mid-term plants, working into long-term, like perennials. One of her comments that really has stuck with me is that you can see a lot of changes if you add, for example, fertilizers, potassium in particular. That has an impact on the soil, obviously, which has an impact on the plants that grow there, which then have a further impact on the soil and so on. I mean, there's so much synergistic stuff that goes on. I don't think, by and large, we even understand a lot of it yet. But the comment that stuck with me was that nothing has as big of an impact on the soil as fire. Fire has always been this sort of mysteriously good thing, in my view. I did have a great uncle who I think was an arsonist. I'm not sure, but the night that the gem store burned down on White Bear Lake in about 1960, he was killed on Highway 61, mysteriously escaping the fire. That's a true story. Anyhow, I guess I can't put him in jail. The fire impact, I've always said, is a sort of mysterious benefit. And it's always kind of hard to put your arms around just exactly what the hell am I talking about. I don't really know. I've never really known, but what if, just what if, burning across the top has enough impact on the mycorrhizal activity in the soil that changes the comfort zone of the native plants. And so that maybe that's the answer. Maybe it's actually the fire's impact on the soil that makes the prairie better. And we've always said, well, fire adds potash and it gives a short-term burst of nutrients. In reality, if you burn every year, you're reducing the nutrient content of that site, because some of it goes away in smoke. So if you burn on a real regular basis, you're diminishing the richness of the ground. However, there could be that doesn't consider the changes that are caused by fire in the kinds of things that are in the ground. And I think it does. We tend to think it's a surface thing, but what if it actually has an impact 12 inches down or 2 feet down? It could. And so anyway, you know, fire, I'm a big advocate of using fire. We do it all the time. We do 300 or 400 burns every spring for our clients. Woodland fires, I think, are particularly valuable for controlling buckthorn. So again, one has to be careful and, you know, This is a nice, really ideal woodland burn. It's pretty passive, nice. This is out there by the truck, obviously a road, a fire break, burning back from the fire break, making that break even bigger, burning a head fire. They come together. Little invading trees and shrubs get set back to the ground. Most of the bigger trees weather a passive fire like this without any real serious harm. Thin-skinned trees might. Aspen, for example, you might kill off the above ground, but the clone will come right back and be very viable. So then I think this might be the end of the slides. Yeah, right here. This is a beautiful prairie, by the way, not too far from here. If you ever want to see the Ordway Prairie, it's up by Sunburg, and it's along Highway 104. It's beautiful, and Colleen, thank you, Colleen, by the way. She put these slides together for us. This is a good one at the end because obviously we're on a high hill, and it shows maybe more than any other place that I can think of that's still intact, that relatively, in this case, abrupt transition from an oak woodland to an open grassland. Now, in many cases, if you look at the Marshall map, that transition could take 20 miles. In this case, it was condensed down to maybe a mile. So this literally is about, I don't know, from here it's probably 60 or 70 miles, and it is literally kind of the edge of the woods and the beginning of the grassland. And so that's really not a lot different than what you would have seen in 1850, let's say. As you emerged out of the forest and more or less out onto the Great Plains, you would find these, thickets of sumac and juneberry and chokecherry, no buckthorn in those days, and then bur oak mostly would be the more edge tolerant. You can visualize a fire coming from the west, running across this, hitting the woods. Unless it was extreme conditions, it would pretty much be over. Might penetrate, maybe it would go in half a mile at the most, but probably not even that. More like 100 yards and it would be over. And so there was your balance right there. The fire is keeping this open and not really able to penetrate very far into the woods. So that tension line was moving. Now if you look at the big picture though, let's say 1,000-year picture, the woods was gradually gaining to the west. At the time of settlement, the woods were expanding, and one of the handouts that you have is by a guy named Grimm, and he and a professor named Ed Cushing. Does anybody know Ed Cushing? Yeah. Do you? Good. And these guys are really brilliant, and they know so much more than I do about all this, but Grimm Grimm's work shows that the big woods, which is the woods more a little south of here, basically this woods right here, really was prairie in 1500, just 500-600 years ago. That was all grassland. And it got started with a little tiny blob of maple basswood forest. And over the last 500 years, it's just exploded. And so, one can ask why. Well, maybe the climate got a little wetter, or maybe got a little cooler in those days. Now, it's getting warmer, and so maybe it'll go the other direction. But in the last 500 years, evidence would say that woods is brand new. So when I worked west of the metro at Bruce Dayton's as a gardener, his property was a maple basswood forest, and there were some 300-year-old sugar maples. I cut one down that was 315 years old. I didn't necessarily want to, but I was told to do that. And after a year or two of protesting, I finally gave up and I cut it down. Well, I decided to count the rings, and it was 315 years old. Pretty old tree. Now you think about that. If that, what I just said is right, that the big woods, which that's kind of the heart of the big woods, is 500 years old, that was probably a first generation sugar maple. Because they're not pioneer species. They come in to a shaded woodland already. So normally they're preceded by oak trees or maybe aspen and so on. And they come in as kind of the final wave of shade tolerant species. So that tree could have been one of the very first sugar maples in that area in recent time. Recent time meaning, let's say, the last 5,000 years. Something like that. So it's very interesting, when you think about that though, because it really gets you to understand that all these plant communities were in transition. Pretty much they were. They, if you look at over a long enough time period, nothing stays the same. And of course, as I started out by saying, the last 200 years have been dramatic because we've lost all the prairie. How much time have we got? Okay. And we've taken all the prairie away, virtually, which I think is, of course, I'm an environmentalist, and I get pretty concerned about that. So you think about that, you think about the biomass that was stored underground in ruts up until about 150 years ago. And now that's all pretty much gone, and I think we're only beginning to see the impact. It takes a long time for some of these things to show up. By our calendar, about 150 years is a millisecond, in the big picture. So it's logical that the impact on temperature, on water, on soils is only really starting to surface. And who knows where that'll go. So again, I don't mean to be an alarmist at all, but I think we have to learn to think about longer time periods than what we usually do. We live about 80 years. We tend to think about 80 years. And that makes sense, but in the big picture, it's not very accurate. Maybe I should take a question or two. Sure.
Are they bringing buffalo back, Eddie?
This one, no. This is about 900 acres. This is a nice prairie. Now, there's another Ordway Prairie in South Dakota near Leola. If you look at North and South Dakota, right near the south-north line, and about a third of the way into South Dakota is Leola. That's a 7,000 acre prairie, and they have a permanent, pretty much free roaming herd of about 300 buffalo bison at that site. That first picture with the yellow coneflower was from that prairie. So again, there are a lot of efforts to reintroduce bison. Bellwin Nature Center over in St. Paul's puts them out for a month or two. They're here and there, and The problem is, again, I'm not an advocate of grazing. There's a lot of people, including like the Sherburne Refuge, is using grazing now. A lot of people are advocating grazing for management of vegetation. I just don't, I'm not on board with it. No matter what you do, you're confining these animals to a less than natural area. Bison roamed 500 miles. And to put them in even a square section, let's say 600 acres, or I don't care, 10 sections, that's about a week's worth of roaming around for them, and then they're moving on. But you put the fence up and they don't do that. So when you go out to the Ordway Prairie in South Dakota, parts of it are pretty beat up. And they're not beat up from cattle, they're beat up from bison. What's the difference, really? So there's all kinds of research going on with, well, cattle have different digestive systems and microorganisms in their gut, and it's different, and they provide food for other animals that come and pick up the dung, and that's different. One thing or another, I think the end game is still grazing in a confined, repetitive fashion is hard on our native plants. It is. So, I don't know. This one was grazed before the Nature Conservancy bought it. And so this is recovered from grazing. It's a beautiful prairie. Anybody else?
Could you talk about the topography and the Oak Savannah Prairie? I mean, you're in Sherburne, so you're on the Anoka Sand Plain.
Yeah.
What about over here where it's more hilly, rolling?
Yeah, I like the question because I meant to say that, the Avon Hills, as a terminal moraine or a moraine, creates a block. A lot of times people think, gee, prairies are, especially if they think about what's called a goat prairie, they dominate these dry hilltops or south-facing or west-facing slopes. But in reality, hilly areas create a block to the wide-ranging fires because the north slopes are quite the opposite. So the fire might come raging into this, and then if we'd hit the hill, say it was a flat plain for 100 miles west, that's wonderful for a fire. The fire can just get going, give it a 20 or 25 mile an hour wind, and oh boy, nothing's going to stop that. When it hits a hill, it might come up real good, but then when it hits the downside, it's going to be wooded, or cooler, or wetter, even if it's not forested. And hence, over a period of many decades or even centuries, those areas ultimately form into a forest and create a fire break. And so the Avon Hills being one of those areas, it would be logical that this would have been a more forested area. The fires to the west coming from the plains would run into the hills and slow down. And ultimately the trees would gain the upper hand here. And so, we look at the woods, and I'm sure there's somebody here who knows all of the property here better than I do. But there's a lot of mature maple basswood forest here. My speculation is that if you really age those oldest trees, most of them are probably 300 years tops. And before that, it might have been prairie. I don't know. The Marshall map shows just south of campus here what was called kind of a brushland category. And those categories are also on a handout here. And then it also shows, and if you want to come up and look at the map itself, a pretty big open prairie that was just, we're right on the edge of it. I would say between here and Waite Park and St. Cloud, there was a lot of open prairie. In not Savannah, open prairie. So, and then when you get to the Mississippi River, of course, there's sand terraces that are droughty, and those tend to be prairie anyway. So, yeah. But I think this faded, as the hills came in, this faded into or morphed into more of a maple basswood forest. And I know by the time you get over towards Avon itself, you know, there's a pretty mature maple basswood forest there. So anyway, that's just my guess. All right, don't hold me to it.